Welcome to this special presentation of Main Brothers, a documentary. Main Brothers is a name that I am sure you are all familiar with. Allow me to introduce myself. I am Ed Annable. I grew up about 2.5 miles south of Cyprus, and when I was young, I spent many days in Karnak with my grandmother, Bessie Belford, and I remember Main Brothers very well. Myself and my wife, Diane, have written several books on the history of our area. Here are a few of those books. People have been asking us to write a history of Main Brothers, but up to now we have been reluctant to do so because we are far from being experts on the subject. We have, however, decided to take on this work, but of course we will need to rely on many of you to help us. The research and interviewing people may take as long as 2 years before we are ready to publish. The image of the book that you see is only preliminary and will probably look entirely different before we finish. In 1997, I was involved in the history of the Cache River, a project sponsored at that time by the Cache River Wetlands Joint Venture. During one of those meetings, I introduced the idea that the Cache River itself had developed a unique culture among its people. In that year, myself and Maggie Redcloud, an employee of ID&R, began to interview people and discover how the Cache River had influenced their lives. Our part of the project involved those whose lives were affected by the upper Cache River, or that part above Belknap or above Karnak for our purposes here. We interviewed these people in our work and found several interesting stories. I plan to use some of their stories for our book. Following that, Gary Hacker, who grew up in Vienna, began to make interviews of people on the lower Cache River. He interviewed these people, and we plan to use some of those stories also in our book. Recently, I was speaking with Max Hutchison and Charlie Proctor. I am sure some of you know these two gentlemen. Mr. Proctor, of course, is a descendant of the Main family. I told them a story that Charles said he would like to see at the beginning of our book. And here is that story. Once, several years ago, a simple canning jar was part of a wedding gift to my niece on her wedding day. Inside was a story that I had written. The story said that she would not exist to be married that day if it were not for that canning jar. Now let me explain what I meant by this. My grandfather, on my mother's side, Ray Belford, worked for Main Brothers in Karnak as a carpenter. That was his official title. If Main Brothers had not existed, he would not have lived in Karnak. He and my grandmother were living there because her father had at one time been the pastor of the Methodist Church in Karnak. His name was Acton Hicks, and he would have never come to this place if Main Brothers had not built this town. And I am told that they were also responsible for the church building. My great-grandfather on my dad's side, Samuel Greenberry Annable, purchased a farm that had once been unfarmable because it was often inundated by the waters of the Cache River. The whole area near the sluggish and slow-moving Cache River remained inundated with water and mud for several months of the year, as this article states from the Vienna Times of April the 23rd, 1904. Reading from that article, it says, in the extreme lower end of Egypt, southern Illinois, in what is known as Cache Valley, is an agricultural gold mine, a bonanza, awaiting some favorable attention of the state authorities to make it a habitable spot and free it to some extent from the ravages of flood, which for 8 months render it a regular swamp, and for the balance of the year a veritable quagmire. The ground thus going to waste comprises no less than 250,000 acres, which lie in the counties of Pulaski, Union, Johnson, Alexander, and Massac. Listen to another part of this news article. In order to reclaim the land, it is only necessary to make Cache carry off all the water that it picks up from its watershed, and to do this, dredging and a diverting of the stream in several places would be necessary. Take a look at some of these old maps that show the flooded areas in the Cache watershed. If it had not been for Main Brothers and the state of Illinois' drainage projects, Samuel Greenberry Annable would not have lived on that farm, and his son, my grandfather, Alvin Lindsay Annable, would not have met my grandmother, Lily Steele, and they would not have had a son named Doyle, my father, and Doyle would not have met my mother, Mary Ellen Belford, at the Karnak High School, because she would not have lived in Karnak, and I would not have been born. My brother would not have been born, and his daughter Dana would not have existed to be married on that day. Now, here is an interesting question for any of you watching this. How many of you would not exist today if it had not been for Main Brothers? But what does a canning jar have to do with any of this? There was a glass company in Swayze, Indiana that made canning jars. The glass factory shown here was also near a factory that made wooden boxes for shipping those canning jars. During their years of operation, Swayze Glass Factory found itself in financial troubles. A young bank employee by the name of Robert Joseph Maine was sent to Swayze to see about their situation. When he returned, he asked the bank to lend him the money so that he could purchase the glass factory. I am sorry that we do not have a better photo of Mr. Maine. We are still searching for photos of the rest of the Maine brothers at this time. Robert J. Maine was now in charge of a glass factory. He returned to Swayze and soon found that the company was having a hard time finding materials for making shipping boxes. The forest had been depleted around Swayze of the type of wood favorable for making these boxes. so Mr. Maine began to look elsewhere for the best wood. Mr. Maine, no doubt, had heard of the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. He had most likely known that trainloads of cypress wood from the Cache River watershed had been shipped to that city to help it rebuild. Southern Illinois, particularly our area, was developing new railroads at the time, and R.J. Maine was aware of these new railroad connections and realized that he could use them to ship wood back to Swayze. He came to Reevesville in southeastern Johnson County, where a Mr. Holyfield, according to the Maine family history, had a sawmill and was able to obtain the Tupelo wood that he desired to make his shipping crates. The swamps of southern Illinois, especially along the Cache watershed, had vast amounts of white tupelo, so recognizable because of their swollen lower trunks. Many of you will recognize these trees. I have to say at this point in our research, we have discovered that Robert J. Maine was planning to set up business in Illinois as early as 1902, according to this newspaper article published in the Inner Ocean, a Chicago newspaper, on March the 11th, 1902. There is some evidence that they were actually incorporated in Illinois as early as 1898. We are still exploring that. Mr. Maine then came to a place that at one time was known as Obert's Switch and found a Mr. Dye who had a sawmill there and purchased it. This place would later become known as Rago. Max Hutchison and myself have had several discussions about the names Obert Switch and Rago. Here's something I'm just now exploring. The CNEI Railroad laid the track that ran through Karnak and on to Joppa in 1900. Along this track was the sawmill of Mr. Dye. What that stop was known as is where the name Obert Switch came from, or I'm thinking that is a possibility. I remember in my younger days that there was a sign on the railroad at the Charles Stone Company at Whitehill that read Chasco, the railroad's name for that stop. There is a possibility that both Obert Switch and Rago may have been names given by the railroad. We're still looking into that. After purchasing the sawmill from Mr. Dye, Robert J. Maine then purchased the veneer mill equipment being used at the box factory in Swayze and had it shipped to Rago. He then sent his brothers David and James to Rago to operate the mill, along with Ott Corliss, an engineer from Ohio. The little town of Rago sprang up as the veneer business grew. It was complete with a post office and a store. The Maine brothers, as they were known, built houses for their employees along the Cache River, as can be seen here, along with the store. They also built a school for the children of their employees. Rago was not just a working town. There was a community there. Look at this article in the Carroll Bulletin for July the 5th, 1904. It says, "The game between Vienna and Rago yesterday resulted in a score of 18-5 in favor of the Vienna boys. Perhaps the Rago team was not as good as the Vienna team. but it shows that there was a real sense of community among those that lived here. Rago, for those who are unsure about the location of the place, can be seen on this map. It was located just south of Whitehall, where the Barkhausen Wetland Center now sits. In July 1904, the Main brothers began to expand their business. They saw the opportunity for better shipping advantages by locating where the CNEI Railroad crossed the Big Four, as it was known at that time, at a place known as Oaktown. This, of course, would later become Karnak. Oaktown was not just another place in the woods that had a post office. There was a sawmill here as early as 1884. Look at this news article from the Herald and Review, a Decatur, Illinois newspaper, October the 18th, 1884. And it says, Bartleson's sawmill at Oaktown near Cairo was destroyed by fire on Wednesday. Here's an interesting article from the Vienna Times, June 1st, 1905, and it says, Karnak is to be the name of the new town at the crossing of the Big Four and the CNEI below Belknap. The point has been called Oaktown, but hereafter the official name of the place is to be Karnak. Farther down in the article it says, the enterprising firm of Main Brothers Box and Lumber Company are interesting themselves in the town, and a number of men with capital are eagerly seeking to invest in land in that vicinity. In 1904, they moved their veneer operations there. In that same year, they purchased 1,040 acres, with most of it lying in Johnson County. They eventually owned 28,000 acres. This map, displayed at the Wetland Center, shows the holdings of the Main brothers. I apologize for the poor quality of the photo, but here is the same map from the special collections at Southern Illinois University. Main brothers were not only in the timber business, but they were also in the farming business. What we do know about the farming business at this time is that they raised row crops, they raised Hereford cattle, and at one time raised tomatoes or tomato plants. Here's an article concerning raising those tomato plants. This is from the Vienna Times of June 10th, 1937. Within the past 2 or 3 years, a new industry has sprung up in Pulaski County, which borders Johnson County on the south. According to the Carroll Evening Citizen, Pulaski County produced 36 million tomato plants this season. The chief growers were Main Brothers of Karnak and C.E. Ritchie of Mound City. Both had 75 acres each in tomato plants. We are just now beginning to uncover the extent of those farming operations. Here's an interesting story we are investigating. When Main Brothers moved a part of their operation to Oaktown, they cleared a section of woods, leaving the stumps all at a certain height, we are told. They then built houses for their workers, using these tree stumps as the foundations for their houses. Thus, that area known as Stumptown. In their early years of operations here, R.J. Main began to explore the possibility of making a glass manufacturing plant here in southern Illinois. He found that the materials for making glass could be found at a place then called Glass Hill for obvious reasons. This has always been known around Cypress as Round Bluff. As late as 1904, we find evidence that Main Brothers was still interested in establishing a glass manufacturing facility at or near Karnak. Look at this article from the Carroll Bulletin of February the 25th, 1904, and please excuse the misspelled word in the beginning. We'll make the correction as we read it. The new veneer factory, owned and controlled by Main Brothers, will soon be in operation, and also a new glass plant will be put up at Oaktown. It will no doubt furnish plenty of work in our section of the country. RJ soon found that the box making industry could be more lucrative than the glass business and sold his Swayze glass manufacturing plant to the Ball brothers in 1906. He then dedicated all of his efforts to the manufacturing of shipping crates. In 1910, R.J. Main purchased a dredge boat from Marion, Ohio, and had it shipped to Karnak, where he used it to divert the cash closer to the place where he was setting up a sawmill there at Karnak. He brought the sawmill to Karnak in 1912, ending the operation at Rago. He also began to straighten other parts of the cache and found better ways to float logs to the mill. During dry weather, ditches were dug near where the timber had been cut. The logs were moved to these ditches, and when the waters rose, they were floated down the cache to the mill at Karnak. Riding the logs and poling them was a skill that had to be learned. Max Hutchison said he asked his dad if he ever fell off these logs, and he said that he told him that he got wet every day. I should mention here that Max, in collaboration with Joe Ashby, is writing at this time an excellent and very thorough book about Belknap. He will be including a considerable amount of information about Main Brothers, and he's sharing a lot of this with us, and that's why we have so many discussions with him at this time. Here is Max and Joe discussing their recent book published 2 years ago, A Gazetteer of Johnson County. And now back to our story. This device, known as a log dog, is what helped tie logs together when making floating rafts of logs. These dogs became well known in the logging operations around Karnak. They first began to move their cut timbers into these log highway ditches, then into the main channel and on through this gate and on to the sawmill. Here are several rafts of logs tied together by these dogs so they might be towed. Main Brothers built this small steam-driven boat, especially designed for towing log rafts in the Cache River. They named this boat the Belle of Cache River. Many of the workers for Main Brothers spent their time moving logs and working from these small boats and never saw the operations at the sawmill. Not only was the moving of logs on the minds of the Main Brothers, but the health of the community was important to them. Warren Main, a son of Robert J. Main, said this back in 1997 during an interview. There has been in the past some criticism on the drainage, draining the land. But he drained it because of the malaria and the sickness. Then, of course, by having that drained, they could get the timber out. But my mother contracted malaria and she had it all her life down here. There was a lot of people. People just kept quinine on their shelves just all year long. Quinine became a daily ritual for people living in this malaria infested area of southern Illinois. Someone said that an eighth of a teaspoon was taken at every meal as a means of avoiding the illness caused by malaria. The cause of malaria was discovered about the same time that Rago and Karnak were developing. Mr. Maine was, I'm sure, aware of the malaria problems that had caused so many deaths when the Panama Canal was being dug. All this was occurring at the same time that Maine Brothers was making this little oasis in this malaria infested area of the Cache River. They were ahead of their times in trying to help drain some of the swamplands in order to improve the health of the community. Because of the drainage, land was regained from the swamps, and Maine Brothers not only found themselves in the sawmill and shipping container business, but successful in their farming operations. They employed many men on the farms, men who would have been struggling to make ends meet on their own. Maine Brothers, the box factory as it was known around Karnak, was now an established business, and they began to explore other types of shipping containers for fragile items such as egg cases. We have not yet discovered an authentic egg case made by Maine Brothers in that period of time, but here's one from that same era. We're still looking for an original Maine Brothers egg case. Always finding new and better ways of making shipping containers, James Maine created and patented the James crate. The simplicity of this crate was how it was made, so that it might itself be shipped as a flat item with a separate bottom. When assembled, it became a useful utilitarian box. The top was made such that it could be grasped and carried easily. This advertisement for the James crate shows its simple design and suggests its use. The second page of this advertising circular shows how that after assembly they could be stored and carried when empty, taking less space than the normal box. They came in 3 sizes: 4/5 of a bushel, 1 bushel, and 1 1/4 bushel. Here is one used by the Campbell Soup Company, suggesting that Maine Brothers was well known nationally. This notation that accompanied this James crate states that it was most likely used by the V8 division of Campbell's Soup. Maine Brothers developed the machinery necessary for producing wire-bound boxes as a trademark of their workmanship, as this machine that stapled wire and wood, the wood pieces assembled by the workers in this photo. Here is a look at some of the many machines used in the box factory. As Main Brothers grew, they at one time employed more than 200 people. A look at the census of 1910, 1920, 1930, 1940, and 1950 shows that most of the people living in Karnak were working either at the box factory or the sawmill. Someone made a list of the contributions the Main Brothers had on their community. They provided jobs and homes for the local community. They provided electricity to Karnak years before REA became a part of our country. They built churches and schools and other public buildings. They provided a market for landowners who had timber on their property. They helped families who were devastated by sickness or house fires. They lived in their communities and shopped there like everyone else. They also set standards for their business and their workers, as this article from the Carroll Bulletin of 1909 first appeared in the Pulaski County Enterprise. It says, "It was the understanding of the temperance people of our city that the Main Brothers Box and Lumber Company of Karnak were in favor of saloons, and with this understanding in view, they wrote this company asking their opinion and received in answer the following letter. October the 26th, 1909, addressed to the Pulaski Enterprise from Main Brothers. Gentlemen, we note with pleasure the position taken by all the leading manufacturers of Mound City against the return of saloons, and as there been a report of our company is inclined to favor the saloon, we take this opportunity to emphatically deny said report and to add that we believe that the saloon, with its accompanying drunkenness, is of the greatest detriment to the working man and to his fellow workmen, the manufacturer. All manufacturers or businessmen whose affairs are prosperous are looking for young men capable of filling responsible positions. We find that a man who drinks cannot be trusted with responsibility. Even a moderate drinker should not have and is not entitled to have his employer give his time and patience to teaching him to fill a responsible position, for sooner or later the manufacturer will find that he has wasted him time and labor, for the man, instead of becoming more competent, will in time have to be discharged or removed from his responsible position. We expect to show our preference along this line to young men who do not drink at all. Signed, Main Brothers Box and Lumber Company." Main Brothers has had its share of problems, mostly by fire. Look at this article from the Vienna Times of May 24, 1934. Then this April the 5th, 1956 article. Then later that year, August the 23rd, 1956. We are still at this time trying to find information on the Main family. There is much that we know, but there is yet much to be discovered. The father of this family was David Main Sr., the husband of Sarah Egbert. According to some reports, there were 14 children born to this Ohio couple. Not all of them lived to be adults, of course. Robert J. was the first child and always seemed to lead in everything that the family did. These are the 4 men whose names appear on the business card when they began their business at Rago. However, there was one sister that was deeply involved in the business at Karnak, and as far as we know, never married. Jesse Main was indeed one of the Main brothers, as far as the business was concerned, but she lived in a time when only men held official positions in business. Again, I will refer to a conversation that I had with Max Hutchison, as I've done many times. He said that Main brothers never put a fence around their operations, and it was evident that they didn't mind if someone carried a board home now and then. My grandfather, Ray Belford, was a carpenter by occupation, and he worked at Main Brothers, as I have already mentioned. He made this chest, which belongs to my sister. It appears that he might have carried a board home now and then. I am sure that there are many examples of things made from Main Brothers wood, and we'd like to see some of these if anyone would like to show them to us. This, by the way, is known as folk art. We are hoping to photograph any of these folk art items, and we're also interested in stories that you might have of Main Brothers. This is going to be a book that future generations will enjoy, and we hope to include some of your stories in it. It is important that we do this now before another generation passes and the name Main Brothers is forgotten or has no significance at all to the generation that is present. We have been surprised that many of the younger generation have never heard of Main Brothers. I wonder what they think when they see the sign that says Main Brothers Campground. We hope that with your help, we can produce a book that honors not only Main Brothers, but all the people who are employed by them. We close with a few images of the Main Brothers operation, and we thank you.